Hey Computer, play About Bees podcast.
Hello, everybody. You're listening to About Bees, Culture, and Curiosity with René Miksha
and Bidzina Mosiashvili.
Bidzina, what are we doing today?
We're going to be talking about, do bees feel pain?
And what do you think?
Or bugs in general. But I think they do, probably in a different way than we feel pain. But they got to feel pain because I think one of the most painful stings or the most painful things a human can have an interaction with another animal other than a bite is a insect sting. So they can induce pain.
Yeah.
One of the most painful things is one of like those. I can't recall the insect, but there's a guy on YouTube where he gets stung by them.
Okay. And then he died?
No. He does this over and over again.
And then he died?
He hasn't died yet.
Okay, he will.
Steve Irwin. He's not Steve Irwin.
No, Steve Irwin. I loved that guy. He was quite the adventurer, and what a tragedy because he was pretty young too.
Yeah, he was. But yeah, they can induce pain. I don't know. They can create a lot of pain.
So your thought is if they can create pain, then they can probably sense pain.
I'm thinking, yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise...
Or maybe they have a really high pain tolerance since they can dish so much out.
Yeah. Speaking of pain tolerance, we're in Calgary, and you were in Toronto. Now, that's a pain in itself, just to be in Toronto. What was going on down there for you?
There was a tech conference in Toronto. I was there for about a week. It's called Collision Conference. It's hosted by Web Summit. They do different events in Singapore, Lisbon, Portugal, and they're moving now to Vancouver. But they call it the Olympics of Tech.
The Olympics of Tech.
This is what Politico wrote about them.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so we have numbers get thrown around here, but supposedly $3 billion worth of investment takes place after the companies that attend Collision. They get $3 billion worth of investment takes place.
Did you get a few million out of that deal then? You were there?
I was there for advice and consultation.
They were asking you questions.
No, I was asking them questions, but it did turn into them asking me questions.
Good.
Because
yeah.
People don't really know about bees. This is what I found out.
That's pretty much true.
But what I did get is, Toronto is painful. Traffic is horrible. But it was my first time. So I've been in Canada for 19 years. I landed in 2005. I've had one layover flight in Toronto in 2005 when we came here, and I've had another layover flight when I went to Portugal last year. So I've never officially have been to Toronto for 19 years
until last week.
Until last week. I got to say the hype is real.
Okay.
The Niagara Falls lived up to it. And, I think it can be given the title as the crown jewel of Canada.
No. Calgary has that claim. The Economist magazine, it has a sister publication that analyzes all the cities in the world and ranks them by livability.
Right.
And that includes everything from how clean the city is, how good the education system is, how good public transport is, et cetera, et cetera. And do you know which city came in number 5 in the world and the only city in North America, actually the only city in all the Americas to even place in the top 10 was Calgary.
Right. Actually, I just saw a post from Jody Godnick. She, I don't know if I said that right.
Yeah, I don't care. But she's the mayor of Calgary.
Yeah, she's the mayor of Calgary. She just made a post where Calgary is its 5th place. It ranked
number
5th,
5.
Yeah, and 10 years in a row or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And first in North America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but
okay. So the crown jewel.
Yeah.
So somebody kicked the crown jewels.
I don't know. It's a very beautiful place. It's what I got. It's just it has history there.
Toronto, you're talking about, not Calgary.
Toronto.
Okay.
But Calgary too. But I'm just saying Toronto is Toronto. It's just that's where kind of Canada began.
Yeah.
And you can sense it.
We can say that, but I think it's the Atlantic. But anyway.
Okay. But the traffic was horrible. And then I also did get a pretty bad. So they have a horrible e-bike sharing system. What happened? I was riding the e-bike and I was trying to get to my destination and at the same time trying to find a dock. And I guess I shouldn't have been on my phone, but I was on the GPS and I flipped. It was a really high sidewalk, and these electric bikes, when you just give it a little jerk on the pedal, it goes pretty fast. And I jerked it a little bit, and I went off the sidewalk while on my phone and my tripod in my hand. I flipped and pretty much landed on my elbow, and I thought I broke it. Here, I'll show it to you.
Oh, I don't think I want to see this.
I still got to get an X-ray because it really hurts, but it's a little bit better now.
Yeah, nice color.
Yeah, like it was just I don't know if you can see it, but we
can see it.
Yeah, my doctor said I popped a blood vessel. The medic said, I just got
bleeding underneath the skin.
Yeah, bleeding underneath the skin. I didn't break it. I did a judo rule. I was all fine, but that was the last day after no injuries. And then that same day,
broken arm.
That's how I felt. I couldn't even use that arm that day at all. Like I was.
So you went out to celebrate at a pub, I'll bet.
I did. Well, it was the last day, and it was collision. So these tickets are $1,500 to get into these events, and I got a scholarship to be there.
Yeah.
And so it's a conference. So what are they spending $1,500 on a conference? So they got to be using this money somewhere. So they have a bunch of after parties. Every single day, they had a list of after parties that you could go to. And on Thursday night, they had their final after party at a pretty high-end club. I decided to go to it. And one of the guys there decides to pick a fight with me while my arm is broken. He was the king of Toronto, he tells me.
He was the king. I didn't know that Toronto had a king. I know Saskatchewan has the Queen of Canada living in it, but Toronto has a king. So this guy decides he wants to beat you up?
Well, so we're in the MV. So like we get the conference rents out this area for the members. Whoever has attended, you can go to the VIP section, and we're in the area, and I'm in the back room. I'm sitting, and I'm sitting amongst the girls, and I guess he was trying to hit on one of the girls that I was sitting beside. And he comes over to me and he tells me I'm in his seat. And I decided to ignore him. And he starts to get aggressive. So I started to pulled my camera out, document the situation. He knocks my phone out and starts yelling, "I'm the king of Toronto."
He started yelling, "I'm the king of Toronto."
Yeah, he's like, "You better get out."
I think the guy was a little off, and it was probably time for you to move.
Well, that's right. There was a seat right beside us. So I'm like, okay, let me just move over there. He sat beside the girl, and then she left. Conference people.
Well, I'm glad you made it back from Toronto. Did you see any bees while you were there? Because this is a bee podcast. I guess we gotta circle back to bees at some point.
No, but people were really interested about bees.
The people, as in people from Toronto.
The collision conference.
Why didn't you tell the king of Toronto that you are a beekeeper, just like they had the movie about the beekeeper?
You know what? That was my party trick.
Yeah.
I was telling everybody I was a beekeeper.
Oh, that'll get the girls. Good for you.
It kind of did work a little bit.
Yeah, that's surprising.
Well, you got to match it up with you can't just say you're a beekeeper. You have to have a little bit of game. And I was dressed a little nice, fancy, and kind of odd, like out there, obscure.
Yeah.
So yeah, it matched the persona.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And since nobody there knew who you were, you might not even be a beekeeper.
Yeah, I might not even be a beekeeper.
Say you're a beekeeper.
That's right.
Okay. So speaking of bees and beekeepers, I think we probably need to hit the main part, and that is
So I felt a lot of pain. I'm still in pain.
Have you ever been stung?
I say that I've been stung 1,000 times, but I talked to a beekeeper and he said you can't hit. It's like you got to. That's a 10-year mark is when you hit 1,000 stings.
Well, it depends what you're doing.
Well, right, exactly, and how many bees you're keeping.
Yeah. But you might have been stung 1,000 times.
500, 1,000.
Yeah, if you make enough mistakes, you could be stung 1,000 times.
I've been stung every single time I've been out there.
Yeah, well, then you're making mistakes every single time you're out there.
I'm in my car, and somehow they get me right as I take my beekeeping suit off. Every single time.
Yeah, well, what's that going to teach you?
It's an objective of me to like leave without getting stung. It's like a thing that I try to play a game.
Okay.
Where it's like, don't get stung.
You don't get stung.
But I think I'm doing something wrong.
I'm going to have to guess that you are. But hey, that's okay. Stings are good for you. They're a very healthy thing. So, do bees feel pain? We're going to talk about that. We know that we feel pain when we get stung by a bee, and I'm not even sure if the bee, which will soon die after stinging us, whether the bee feels the pain of stinging us. And, here's what happens. The bee sticks its stinger into our skin, and the stinger has a little bit of a barb at the end. It anchors into the skin, and the bee is stinging, and then finally the bee says, okay, that's probably enough. I think I'll move on and go back to work. Right. And when it moves on to go back to work, part of its innards come right out with the stinger. That's because its intestines are attached to the stinger itself. Right. Now, the advantage to the bee is that it leaves behind a poison sac. Okay. So even if the bee flies on and is long gone, you can still be continually injected by poison. And that sac, I'm going to hold up my fist a little bit. So the stinger and then the sac is like pumping. And if you look at the stinger afterwards and watch it, and the bee is long gone, you'll see that there are muscles that are continuing to contract and push the poison in. Yeah.
Oh, so it's almost like their intention is to get their guts pulled out. To have that muscle there to... Well,
I don't want to say intention, but somehow...
Like they know that's going to happen. That they like.
I don't know if they know that's going to happen, but they have evolved as a creature in a way that this is what works to maintain the survival of the entire colony. Most other bees, I think maybe all the other bees and wasps, can sting multiple times because they do not leave behind their stinger. I think it's only honeybees that leave behind a stinger. Right. So Apis mellifera, probably Apis cerana, which is the Asian equivalent of the Apis mellifera, but I'm not totally sure about that. Anyway, one of the motivations for today's talk, Do Bees Feel Pain, is that it's been so much discussed lately about insects in general, and we're just finally becoming aware of the fact that animals in general need to be treated more ethically.
Right.
And
even bugs.
And even bugs.
Yeah.
So we have to wonder, like, are we obligated to treat bacteria ethically?
Right. How microscopic
how
are we going to get?
That's right, exactly. How microscopic, perfect point. So with the help of somebody I've known for about 22 years, his name is Daniel, he and I wrote an article for the American Bee Journal. And that article was entitled, Do Bees Feel Pain? And we're really lucky today, Bidzina, because...
Right, yeah, this was a surprise to me. I showed up late, and there he was, Daniel. Oh, he came out of nowhere. He's like, are you Bidzina? And I'm like, yeah, so let's bring on Daniel.
So Daniel, the co-author, and the reason he's the co-author is because his specialty, his study in his last year at McGill, which is a university in Montreal, Quebec, his last year of studies there is in neuroscience and in philosophy, and that figures in so closely with the topic of pain, how the wiring in a body works, and what we feel. So we brought him here today especially to talk about trees. Because this is Daniel's main job is to...
Well, I'm glad to be here. So, most of the time in the summer, I come back to Calgary from Montreal, where I go to university.
Sorry, just should we let him do like a full kind of little little spotlight introduction on himself, or just natural?
No. Just let it unfold a little bit here. It's okay. Now, first of all, we know that I've known him for 22 years.
Yeah, because you're my dad.
And that tells you how old he is. And then we've mentioned that that he's studying neuroscience.
Right. They kind of have to put it together.
I'm hoping that most of our audience is bright enough for that. But although you have a good point. Probably,
I don't know.
Yeah.
Just if you want to share.
Okay.
If you feel comfortable sharing.
I go to Montreal to McGill University, and there I'm doing a major in philosophy and a major in psychology. And that's pretty much perfectly suited for the topic of today's podcast.
Tree cutting. Do trees feel pain?
Well, trees certainly don't feel pain.
How do you know?
Well, I would say that they don't have the nervous system required to feel pain, and we'll kind of unpack why that's important.
Wasn't there a movie about some blue creature on another planet that felt pain and was a tree?
I don't know.
Okay. All right.
I don't know if there was.
So trees don't feel pain.
Well, certain types of trees can have reactions to pain. So, for example, if you've planted a tree newly, sometimes because of cutting up the roots and planting it in the ground, it'll have a stress response where its leaves will curl up. And so that might look, or somebody might interpret that as, it looks like the tree is in pain. But it's certainly not. It can't have subjective experiences. And that's another thing we'll get more into.
We don't know that, do we? How do we know that it does not have subjective experiences?
Well, we'll get to that again, and that's the root of the heart problem of consciousness.
Okay. And Daniel, then you're an urban lumberjack during the summers.
Yeah, that's how I pay for my philosophy degree, since philosophy doesn't quite have the career prospects that something like engineering or medicine would. But
I've got a few talking points about insects that I put together, and for those of you who are watching this on the video cast, you're going to see some slides, and for those of you who are driving a truckload of bees in the middle of the night or working in a factory, no, I'm going to say not working in a factory. That'd be a little bit dangerous. But my brother Joe owns a huge greenhouse in Wisconsin, and he tends to listen to a lot of podcasts while he's working there in the middle of the night. So we're going to try to vocalize a lot of what we're showing as slides. But my first image that I've got, it talks about the fact that cockroaches sometimes eat their own innards. And, it's kind of like you have a bug, and the bug is kind of doing its own thing. Now, this has been documented with grasshoppers. Grasshoppers can be eating, like a locust, can be destroying your farm, and a praying mantis can come up behind the grasshopper and start chomping away on the grasshopper, and the grasshopper just keeps on eating. So, Daniel, what's going on there? Why don't they stop and yell and or move on or something? They just stand there and get and cockroaches have been known that if you smash a cockroach, it's been known to turn around and start eating the guts that spilled out of its own body.
Well, what that would suggest to me is that when we're talking about animals kind of lower down on the phylogenetic tree, like a simple organism like a cockroach or a lotus or something like that, their experience of pain, and we shouldn't really say experience of pain, we should rather say that they're nociceptive responses.
And what's that word?
Nociception refers to pain. So the ability to perceive pain is called nociception. And so nociception, so the perception and the acknowledgement, I suppose, of pain by an organism, in simple creatures like a cockroach or a locust is going to be quite rudimentary and quite simple. And so it seems like their nociceptive response, or their response to tissue damage, their registering of pain, would be pretty weak. Because if they can go on and keep eating their innards, they must not be terribly moved, or the nociceptive response in the bug isn't going to be terribly strong.
Right.
So that kind of, from the get-go, kind of suggests to us that maybe there's not much in terms of pain experience, which is quite complex, or the feeling of pain. Maybe it's just kind of a simple response that's really easy to override.
Okay, can I interrupt you with a question then?
Yep.
So in human terms,
yeah,
if I have a malignant tumor well, not even malignant, just a tumor
Yep.
inside of certain parts of my body. I'm not necessarily aware of that, and I don't have any pain from it. Is that right?
That could be true.
So is that nociceptus not working there, or
It probably just wouldn't register. So if you look at the human body, you can create a very interesting map of there are certain parts of the body where there's a lot more nociception. So we're much more acutely aware of tissue damage. So for example, if you get a cut on the tips of your fingers,
ouch?
that's going to hurt a lot.
Yeah.
But if you get a cut, like say on the small of your back or between your shoulder blades, it won't hurt as much by contrast because the density of receptors that are basically paying attention to tissue damage, it's a lot more important from an evolutionary perspective to make sure your fingertips and say the inside of your mouth or maybe your eyes are receptive to pain and are able to register when you're experiencing tissue damage than say between your shoulder blades.
Okay.
And so is this does this take place with other bugs as well, or is this a cockroach thing?
I would guess that this. I don't know that much about the nervous system of different invertebrates, but I would expect that this would probably be shared among a lot of bugs. Yeah.
Okay. I was just because cockroaches are kind of particular where they can survive winters and nuclear radiation. Right.
They're quite robust creatures. Yeah.
Right. But this other bugs do this as well.
Maybe not as much. Like I don't think.
But
they
Well, we
can.
know about the grasshopper because that's been documented that the grasshopper can be eaten by another creature and not be aware. So
I think there was a study actually done with honeybees too, where and I'll get to this, but this is why certain early entomologists who are studying bees thought that bees had no experience of nociception, that is a no reaction to tissue damage whatsoever, because if they're eating honey or if they're sucking on some sugar syrup, they won't respond if you pull out their legs. So they thought that this meant that they have no way of perceiving tissue damage. But then, of course, the interesting thing is if you take away the food and they're just sitting there, they will respond if they experience tissue damage. But early entomologists thought that they just simply didn't register tissue damage because they were so easily distracted by something like a bit of nectar on a plate.
Just to kind of build off of that, they did a study where they took bumblebees and they fed them with sugar water and then sugar water with morphine. Mm-hmm. And then they had a controlled group as well. And they wanted to see if the bees would respond, if they would respond to pain. So they would amputate the bumblebees. And they're like, let's say if it would go to the morphine. But no, they didn't go to the morphine. But what they did find is they went to the nectar. Like they increased appetite to eat the nectar.
Well,
So they think it triggers an immune response when they. So I'm thinking when
my guess would be then, and this would be something to verify, is that morphine is an opiate, and every vertebrate at the very least, the way we deal with pain naturally is we have what's called an endogenous opiate system, and we have endogenous opiates. So if you're in pain and you're saying a situation where it's a really good idea to not be registering that pain, for example, and there have been studies on this, people in battlefield situations or people with a strong stress response, your body will secrete opiates naturally in order to suppress that pain. So the study that you mentioned, my guess would be is that would demonstrate that invertebrates don't have an endogenous opiate system.
Right, exactly. That's what they came to conclusion. They're like, it didn't matter. But they were attracted to the nectar source. Didn't matter if it was morphine or not. They still went to it once they were amputated.
No, that's very interesting. And that gives us a window into the pain perception of invertebrates, because we can tell that right from that study that there probably is no endogenous opiate system. So it's going to be very different from the way humans or vertebrates would experience pain.
So one reason that a creature might feel pain, including humans and maybe bugs too, is so that they learn from the experience and don't repeat the mistake that they made before. And one example that I read about recently, and I'd sure love your comments on this, is one of the most studied insects ever is basically it's the fruit fly. Mm-hmm. And they took some genetically identical fruit flies and placed some of them on something very hot and let their legs get burnt. and then they let them heal completely, and they put them into a cage that was in a room, and the room slowly heated up. And the ones who had been previously burnt were so agitated and anxious to get away that they were banging against the edge of the cage, while the ones who had never experienced a painful burn just kind of sat there like, okay, it's getting warmer.
So, sorry, they can heal?
Yeah, they can heal. Yeah.
I thought once they get damaged, it's very hard for them to heal.
Well, in this particular case, it was a burn on their feet pads.
But that just I'm just like amazed by like.
Well, that idea there, or that study would demonstrate that fruit flies are capable of generalization, which is what allows them to learn. So generalization, with the simple kind of classic example, is something that occurs in like Pavlov's dog. If you repeatedly pair a stimulus with something else, whether it's a reward in the case of Pavlov's dog, where Pavlov would ring a bell and then feed the dog, and ring a bell and then feed the dog, and eventually, if you just ring the bell, it'll start salivating because it has learned to associate the ringing of the bell with a reward. So what's gone on here is we can demonstrate that fruit flies are capable of a similar process of generalization, of pairing some sort of a stimulus, whether it's a hot plate or a ringing bell, with some sort of a response, which would be pain. And this is important because and this is something I'll get to a little bit later, this demonstrates that the experience, or not the experience, but reactions to tissue damage or pain in insects are slightly more complicated than a simple stimulus response reflex. There's a limited amount, at least, of flexibility in how pain is processed in the animal, allowing for it to learn.
Right. So it's not just a chemical reaction that says, this is hot, I'm going to jump off of it, and then it totally forgets the experience and lands back on the hot plate again.
Well, it's gonna be a chemical reaction nonetheless, whether it's a stimulus response or whether it's something more complicated. All this shows is that there's a higher degree of complexity in how how certain experiences are encoded and interpreted by the animal. So yeah, it's not like a knee-jerk reaction. So a knee-jerk reaction is, I think it literally takes 3 neurons, and it's just a very simple circuit, and that's not flexible at all. No matter what, unless you have some sort of neurological damage, you're going to be able to have a knee-jerk reaction when the doctor taps your knee with a hammer.
Okay.
So this basically shows that the experience of pain is more flexible than just a very simple inflexible circuit. In the fruit fly, there's something more complex going on because the fruit fly is capable of learning.
All right. Okay. So you mentioned the hammer on the knee, and we'll come to that. Actually, I want to talk about that a little bit more later, but I still want to investigate a little bit more deeply about how humans can feel pain. And since we have a hammer, we're also going to jump to a nail. So there's a story, well documented and true. In England, there was a gentleman who was working in a construction site, and he jumped off the back of a truck and he landed on a 7-inch nail. The nail went up through his foot, through his boot, came out the top side, and the guy's his worksite buddies cut off the little piece of wood that he had jumped on. So he just had this piece of wood, a 7-inch nail going through his boot, and the guy's screaming. So they rushed him to the hospital. The doctors tried to remove that boot, and they couldn't do it because he was in so much pain. So they gave him morphine and then a little more morphine, and finally they could pull off the boot. And you know what they found?
What?
They found that the nail had totally missed his foot. It had not gone through any part of his flesh. So it was an entirely mental reaction that was treatable with the morphine. So explain that one to us.
This is like that experiment people do where, so they'll take your arm and they'll put you between a curtain.
Okay.
And then, but your other arm is a mannequin.
Yes.
I don't know the experiment. I'm kind of butchering it.
No,
but they hit the arm and then you feel like you got hit.
No, these are both good examples of how pain, at least in humans, the way we perceive pain, is not strictly a biological reaction in kind of a circuit sense. There's a little bit more going on in that. Again, like I said, with the battlefield example. This is a third example of how people on the battlefield this was observed during the D-Day landings, people would have gruesome injuries. And when they were pulled off the field by medics, they refused morphine because they just didn't feel the pain. And because they were, in fact, so relieved to be able to get out of the battlefield that they simply didn't experience the pain. And this shows how context in humans strongly attenuates the experience of pain. So in the first example of jumping on a nail, context seriously attenuated the experience and in a positive sense. So the context of being on a work site, the possibility of and actually seeing a nail go through your boot and thinking it had gone through, that context of the experience strongly attenuated the subjective experience of pain. And the second one, the context of sitting there with a mannequin hand that has been kind of paired with your own hand and then hit with a hammer, that context attenuates your experience of pain. And the context of being pulled off a battlefield does the same.
Right. Now, we were talking about the fly learning not to go back to that room. But what about like ancestral pain learning? You guys know about this?
No, go ahead.
So it's a theory or maybe a hypothesis that we have certain memories passed through our genetics. So that's why we have fear of the dark or fear of monsters.
Snakes.
Or snakes, that's right. They're not necessarily monsters in the dark. They're bears and tigers and lions.
Exactly.
Those are real monsters. So there's these ancestral, but now I'm thinking, let's say one of our ancestors did come I guess we're kind of feeling that pain of seeing it, not necessarily the pain of getting butchered.
Well, what you brought up is really interesting. That the only clarification I would make is that this sort of ancestral memory, this doesn't work across 1, 2, 3, 5,
Right.
10, 20 generations.
Yes.
This works over thousands and tens of thousands
years.
and hundreds of
Right,
thousands.
so
and
it's not epigenetic where
there's a certain element of it that could be epigenetic. That's something that I think there needs to be more research on and that I should read up more on. But what you were saying of monsters in the dark, people aren't actually afraid of monsters in the dark. But what happened is over the past few million years of human evolution and stretching even further back, the members of our tribes and our little societies who evolved to have more fear of a dark forest or a dark space were more likely to survive because those who were brazen enough to go run off into the forest at night and have their poor night vision and get bitten by a snake or get eaten by a tiger or a bear were less likely to pass their genes on. So in this sense, you do get a little bit of memory, so to speak, kind of encoded in our genetics to be afraid of certain things or to have an affinity towards certain things, because having those fears and affinities makes us more likely to survive.
I wonder where racism and what's the other word? Bigotry. Is it bigotry? The cultures?
Yeah.
Where that comes in, because that's probably cultures were fighting for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden in the last 100 years, really, we were just like, all right, we're going to do a peaceful. Kind of semi-peaceful.
The interesting thing is in the same way that darkness is, like you said, kind of to use your term, like an ancestral memory or something that we are genetically and evolutionarily predisposed to have a fear of. There is evidence that we also have a predisposed fear towards other ethnic groups. Now, the interesting thing, however, is babies will display this fear, and there's something called the other race effect in babies, where they're more attenuated to looking at and perceiving particularly female faces of their same race. But what's interesting is as we raise children, we teach them to do a lot of things that they're genetically predisposed to do. Like children are genetically predisposed to go grab cookies from the cookie jar, but we tell them not to. Right. They want to seek out sugar, and we put limits on that. So as a culture, we have
we're born evil.
In a sense, yes. There are certain things that we're predisposed to genetically. For example,
that would be
stranger
considered
fear.
evil in today's culture.
Pardon?
That is considered evil.
Yeah,
or
that
bad.
We can choose to attenuate.
Right.
So you're right in that there is certain amount of stranger or outsider or exogenous ethnic group fear, but as we raise children, we can consciously tell them to control or to mitigate those fears, and we do that.
Yes, but is it possible? I don't know how these studies were done, especially with the children and how they react to people of different races, perhaps. Is it possible that this is just an imprint that they've attained during their first 2 or 3 days of life?
That's actually a very interesting idea. The other race effect in particular that I was talking about with babies who are looking at faces of different races, what happens is as the visual system develops, so babies when they're born have very limited vision. They can only see a few inches from their face.
Right. But they can see mom and they can see what color she is.
Yes, exactly.
Shades
and so as the part of their brain that encodes faces, so this is called the fusiform face area, this is a gyrus kind of at the back of the head, as it becomes more specialized with experience, it tunes into the types of faces it sees the most. And the faces it sees the most are if you have really poor vision because you've just been born and you're being held by your mom, who is of the same race as you, your visual system actually tunes towards seeing mostly female faces of the same race. So our visual system is tuned towards that. And what's really interesting is that we are exceptionally good at discriminating faces of the same or similar ethnicity to us. And we have more difficulty because of this discriminating between faces of different ethnicities to us. And this is simply something built in. So you're right. This is something that because of the early raising of children, we do result in this kind of tuning of our visual system towards certain features. However, if, and this is practically impossible, but if you had a small child and you showed them faces of every single different race every day in equal portions, we wouldn't see this effect. This is just a reaction to how, or this is a result of how children are raised.
That's not tested. We just assume that that's probably the way it would be.
Yeah, that's not tested, but yeah.
Okay, let's get back. Let's get back to...
So if it was raised by, let's say, just the mother passes away for some reason, and then the kid is raised as day one from the father, will they develop the same face recognition towards males of their own race?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's just that I think there are studies that show that children under 6 months, I think the statistic is 96% of the faces they're exposed to are female faces of the same race.
Right.
So.
Okay, so we're wandering off a little bit here, but it's really important because no, that's okay. That's okay. Our thesis, or not our thesis, but our main objective topic here is about pain and the way that it's sensed. Then we kind of branched off into trying to understand how complex it is and how the brain can interpret different things, including jumping on a nail that doesn't actually hurt us, but we think it has. Listening to the 9 Inch Nails when they get a little too rowdy. Anybody know who that is, the 9 Inch Nails?
I've heard of them. I've never actually listened to them.
No,
I've also never listened.
You know
to
what?
them,
I think that's their claim to fame. Everybody's heard of them, but nobody's ever actually listened to them. Kind of a heavy metal rock group, I think, either from Cleveland or Chicago. I don't remember which. It doesn't matter. Anyhow, let's get back to pain. So, what is pain? And we were thinking then of exploring the topic about whether pain is a biochemical reaction and or how much the brain influences the perception of pain.
Yeah, so up on the screen there, we've got the kind of textbook stimulus response reflex, which is the knee-jerk reflex. And I mentioned before that this literally takes 3 neurons. This is a very simple circuit. And every time your knee is hit at this very particular point, I'm actually doing it right now, your leg will bounce slightly. And this is a rigid reflex. It's consistent. And it's not really going to change much. We can override it. That's why the doctor usually distracts you when it happens. But this is a kind of canonical basic reflex.
Okay, let's just stop for a second. I just want to kind of add something totally off topic, but just kind of interesting. You're talking about the typical human being. But I remember being like a 7 or 8 year old child in school when we were examined by physicians to just see if we have any ongoing problems or issues that should be identified in the school context. And that was the tapping on the knee was one of those things they did. Yeah. And I remember so vividly the doctor looking at me and saying, "You don't jerk when I hit you in the knee." Well, years and years later, I found out that people who have a motor neuron disorder similar to mine don't have that reaction. So I've probably had this all my life. It's progressively become worse. But going back to 7 years old, you could whack me in the knee, and I just look at you and say, that wasn't nice.
Now, we're in a very unique position right now where we can ask, Ron, like, do you feel pain in your legs?
Yeah, actually, I do feel pain in my legs. If I get stung in the legs, I definitely feel it. And my legs can get tired and wobbly and so on. What I have is more like a form of paralysis. So with paralyzed people can still feel things.
Oh.
And
the reason being behind that is that again, what I mentioned before, the nociception, the system of neurons that detects tissue damage, is actually separate from the set of neurons that controls motion.
Well, that's really cool. I didn't, you know, how many different sets of nerve systems do we have then? So we have one that senses pain and
so there's two major systems. There's afferent and efferent. So afferent neurons, or the afferent nervous system, is stuff that goes in to the central nervous system, into the brain. And then there's a separate set that goes back out. So one set of neurons will bring sensory information into the brain, and then another set of neurons will send motor information back out from the brain. And of the stuff going in, so of the afferent nervous system, you have ones that control pain response, and those have basically like a fast track up to the brain because it's really important to be able to respond quickly. And slightly more slowly, you have, there are actually 4 different organelles that control different types of motion. So, for example, stretch, or vibration, or deep tissue touch, or very fine tissue touch. And then of the stuff going back out, the motor stuff, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. So stuff that really hypes your body up for action, so increases blood flow, gets you ready to move, and parasympathetic nerves, which go out and kind of relax and shut down the body.
So while we're just on this topic, I asked Gemini Advanced, or Google Gemini, their chatbot, what is pain? So this pain is a complex subjective experience involving both sensory and emotional components. It is typically associated with actual or potential tissue damage, but can also occur in the absence of any physical injury.
Oh, yeah.
And the International Association for Study of Pain defines pain as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with or resembling that associated with an actual or potential tissue damage. So I guess this is a human definition.
Yeah.
This wouldn't be for bugs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, we don't know that yet, do we?
Yeah, and we'll get to because the key word in there was subjective experience.
Right, exactly.
And that's something that we'll get to here because that's pretty complicated. But just to finish off this slide, one of the main questions that we have to approach when we're talking about whether insects feel pain is that we're going to have to look at whether the reaction to tissue damage in an insect is simply a stimulus response reflex, so a very rigid set of neural responses, or whether it has a more complex structure that neuroscientists would call kind of a central emotion state.
Right.
And so that's going to be kind of the key thing that we're going to try to pick apart here.
Okay, and we also have to recognize that the bee's brain or any insect's brain is a whole lot smaller. So how much can we fit into that?
So, it's a whole lot smaller, that's for sure. So the total neurons in a bee's nervous system is just under 1 million. And in contrast, the total...
A million of...
a million neurons, so individual cells.
Yeah.
So what is that comparison to a human or a mammal?
Yeah, so in a human, I don't have any other mammals up here, but in a human, we have 86 billion.
Wow.
So that's a factor of 90,000 times almost. As many neurons in a human brain compared to a bee's brain. So obviously there's a huge difference there. Now the question is whether
don't let that get to your head, people. We're not
we're not that smart.
Well, you can be smart and still be stupid at the same time.
Yeah, but that factor of 90,000 times. The question is if we divide the number of neurons in an organism by 90,000, are we still going to have the neural architecture needed to produce pain or the subjective experience of pain, Or are we left with just these simple stimulus response, knee-jerk type reactions?
Would that depend a bit on how the brain is organized?
Yes, it would depend a lot on the way the brain is organized. That will actually bleed into a philosophical question. But on the more concrete side of things, the human brain is organized. We have a laminar cortex. And what that means is that our brains, basically, they're really wrinkly because we have this massive sheet, or lamina, like we laminate, that's a sheet. We have a huge sheet of neurons with 6 layers. So it's like laminating a sheet of paper 6 times. And it's all folded up and scrunched up, and that's why our brain is kind of squishy, to fit inside of our skull. And this organization of the cortex, and the cortex is that thin sheet I was talking about. The organization of the cortex seems to be critical to complex cognitive functions. And it will eventually be critical to, and we actually don't know quite how, the creation of a subjective experience, something that it feels like. Now, the bee, on the other hand, as we have up here, it does not have a cortex. So instead, the organization of the bee's nervous system is in what are called nuclei and ganglia. And so cells have a nucleus. But this is a different understanding of the word nucleus. Nucleus literally means a nut. So there are these little kind of nut-shaped bundles of neurons that are stuck together, and that's in the brain. And then throughout the body, what we can see up here is that they have what look like small brains, and these are called ganglia. And a ganglion in Greek is a knot. Okay. So it's basically a little knot of cells.
That's their brain.
And so the brain is separate. The brain is made of nuclei, and it's a little bit bigger.
Sorry.
But the ganglia are these distributed, they're almost like micro brains. So essentially you're right there. And
they have multiple different sections that make up what is their brain.
Exactly.
Well, just like ours. But it's more
their nervous
spread
system.
out.
But it's more spread out. So their central nervous system, the central nervous system in humans is essentially the brain and the spinal cord.
Right.
So it's pretty compact in your skull.
Yeah.
But for the bee, it's much more spread out, like you were saying. So they've got a brain, but they also have 7 ganglia, which are these knots of cells.
I'm wondering if that's the case because they got such more compact body, and they don't. So they don't have a lot more because the brain is almost like 25% of the body, right? So
it consumes about 25% of the body's energy.
That's in humans, though,
in
right?
In
humans. But I'm just thinking of like, they're already such a small body, right? How much more compact can you get?
I don't think it's because of the size.
Okay, all right.
But it would be because of the lack or presence of a vertebrae.
Okay, I see. Okay.
So of vertebrates, because if an animal is a vertebrate, it basically means it has a spinal cord.
Right.
Which means that it has a more dense organization of the central nervous system. But bees have exoskeletons to protect them. They don't have a vertebrate, so they can afford to spread out their nervous system. And the presence of ganglia, like we were talking about, these distributed like microbrains or these knots of cells throughout the body, that suggests that
all those little knots you see there, that's every single one of them.
Okay,
is,
now for people who are actually listening and not watching, we're going to have to describe things a little bit more. And I'm going to take a really short break. You're going to edit this out, but I need to say 2 things. Okay, so this is at about time 50 minutes in. Okay. So at about 50 minutes in, I want you to cut out this. First of all, Daniel, when you point up to the screen, your hand is going to disappear.
Oh, shoot.
Because because Bidzina has to put an image over top.
Yeah,
so,
no, you're right.
So if you see light hitting your hand, then you're gonna like it's gonna disappear from the image. And the second thing, Daniel, is you've got to kind of watch how you breathe in.
Oh, breathe into the microphone.
Yeah, because I can hear it so loudly.
Shoot.
And I know it's because you're talking quickly and you're excited, but we need to kind of either back off a little bit when we take a deep breath, or just breathe in very silently.
Okay. I'm also going to run to the washroom really quickly.
Okay, take a
we
washroom
have
break.
about another. So it's 3:07.
Yep.
We have until 3:45. We want to start cleaning her out.
Yep. We'll be okay with that.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, Bidzina, how's it going?
I think it's going well. This is like I'm just like thinking. I'm like, wow, we were just gonna do a little just a little podcast. But no, it's really coming together. And
this is fun. This is really interesting.
Yes.
I like how we diverge. And so I'm going to flip the slides here so you'll know better what's coming up, because I don't want you to be surprised when things come up on the screen. But so we're talking about the bee and its distribution of its brain.
Right.
And then I take its head off. Do you see that? So here's with the head, and here's the head is gone.
I see.
Now, if you cut the head off of a bee, it can still fly. It can still walk.
For how long? Like a chicken? Or?
I don't know. Maybe I think until it runs out of food.
Right.
You know, so it can go on a long time. And here is where we start talking about opium and morphine.
Okay.
But that by giving that to the grasshoppers, and then we're talking about how different kinds of medications or things kind of influence the brain. I was just showing Bidzina what's coming up, so he's not surprised by anything. Then we have a little bit of an issue.
I'm just amazed if you see me like in awe.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
I didn't know. I got into bees like it was a business for me. I wasn't supposed to be talking about bees. Like honestly, like really.
Well, here you are, and
But
you're
now
doing
it's
a
like
great
he's
job.
a
and this is-
native bee council,
And this is fun too. No, it's actually really interesting because like I spend a lot of time amongst these like super wild, like high flying neuroscientists and philosophers and stuff. But then to get to like express the ideas and to be able to like see how people understand and make sense of the ideas is so cool.
Yeah.
Like
no,
that's,
that is probably a lot funner for you
you
because
know, it
like
is
you
fun.
probably like get you'll get like a pushback there because they're like oh well you said this like one incorrect very specific term where you were supposed to use it here.
All right, so the brain is the biggest concentration of neurons for the bee, and then we have these ganglia, these knots of neurons that are distributed along the length of the bee's body. And so it has one brain, it's got these 7 ganglia, and so what that suggests with the ganglia being kind of spaced out along here is a lot of the neurological processing that occurs in the bee will be distributed more loosely across the bee and not as concentrated as we have in humans in one big brain.
We could remove the brain?
Exactly. So you could get a headless bee, and we know that headless bees can still fly around.
Yes.
There are a lot of
Yes.
functions that they can still do that humans without a head obviously could not. Like,
Would it bump into things?
well, it doesn't have eyes, so it certainly
bump
would
into
be.
things. So it does kind of need that head.
Well, of course. Well,
Yeah.
for sensory input.
But what you're trying to say, or what you are saying, is that there are other controls, like muscle controls and
Yes.
so on, distributed throughout the body of the bee.
Yes, that's a result of having these ganglia that are placed along
Bringing
them.
it back to pain, then, if we were to stab the bee, it doesn't necessarily need to convey that pain all the way to the brain.
Probably not. That's so nociceptive responses. So the response to tissue damage could probably be coordinated, and I think it is coordinated in bees through these ganglia.
Now, is it the similar situation? Does the bee get a blood clot when you chop the head off like that? So
I think Dad would know more about this one because.
So there's the picture. We had the bee, and then in the next slide we chopped off the bee's head. So I'm just wondering, does it clot?
Okay,
Like blood?
I don't know the exact answer to that, but you have to remember that the bee's blood system is entirely different than a human. It doesn't have a heart that distributes the blood evenly throughout the whole body through a series of veins or vessels. Instead, its innards sort of float in material that supplies the nutrition. So your question then, if I could rephrase it just a little bit, would be removing the head, does that cause damage like parts of its body oozing out? And
Well,
yeah.
not damage, but is there a defense mechanism where its body seals that?
I don't know the answer. I don't know.
But
don't
probably
know for sure.
because it has.
Probably not, because for one thing, it's not something that would commonly happen, so it doesn't have a natural evolved tendency to patch up a headless part of its body. And in fact, if we look at the bee's stinger coming out, the bee is going to die because its stuff is hanging out. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Okay, I want to move on a little bit more with the insects again. And one of the things that scientists had discovered is the fact that in the case of grasshoppers that are feeling pain, and they felt pain by placing grasshoppers onto a hot plate, and instead of just frying, the grasshopper was able to jump off, unless they gave it a lot of morphine, and then it just kind of stayed there and kind of cooked. So what is that telling us about the effect of morphine, pain, sense?
So the grasshopper did get a reaction to morphine.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, that this is kind of the opposite of what you said here, or that other study showed that you mentioned, in that it seems like grasshoppers would have some sort of an endogenous opioid system,
Right.
because they do show a response with regards to pain with morphine.
Okay, so how does this figure into our whole story about how pain is sensed? Is it coming from the brain? Is this the ganglia that are responding or not responding because they're morphine
Well, this
blocked?
particularly wouldn't suggest anything about ganglia or cortical organization. This would just say that these invertebrates would have some sort of endogenous opioid system, which is, and in humans as well, distributed throughout the nervous system.
Throughout the nervous system.
Yeah.
So it could be with the ganglia. Okay, we've got about a little less than half an hour to go with this podcast today, and there's so much more that would be nice to cover.
This just kind of do you guys know about the frog about the boiling pot?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead and tell us.
So they take a frog and put it in a boiling pot, and then if you were to increase the water, if you were to boil it immediately, it would jump out. But if you do it in increments, it just stays in there, gets boiled.
Yes.
I don't know. I think they actually said this is not true.
It's probably true.
I don't know.
I
think it's
don't-
used more as kind of a
Analogy for
an analogy or kind of a apocryphal tale. So
Yeah. Well, as you
But that's
increase
a-
pain for a lot of humans, we get used to our
Yeah.
situation, and you can just keep putting more rocks in the bag and having us climb up the side of the mountain with them.
Right.
Okay, what's it like to be drunk? Bidzina, you go first. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Actually,
just
the
kidding.
first time I was drunk, I was born in Georgia, so
Not Florida's Georgia.
I didn't want. I didn't mean to. But I was 5 years old. So because in Europe, we drink very young age. I was 5 years old. I was at a party, and I drank some champagne. Very bad hangover.
Did you leave with any women?
Yeah. I remember I was so sick. I slept. It was a summer day, so I slept outside on our little balcony deck on the bed.
oh wow.
Okay.
But the drunkenness, what it feels like, I don't know. For me, it's very euphoric. I find it. It's very they call it a liquid courage, but it's also a depressant. Like it's a depressant where it brings your mood down. But for me, it's always brought my mood up. I've only had situations with beer where it's kind of made me a little bit sleepy.
Yeah.
Certain types of beers.
Yeah.
But most of the time, alcohol will make me euphoric. And liquid courage.
Well,
Daniel, my son, I'm not going to ask you if you've ever been drunk, but do tell us how alcohol can affect a human.
Well, no, this is very interesting because what it's like to be drunk and what it's like to feel pain, these kind of are going to push to the center of the question that we're trying to discuss here. Because our discussions about whether or not bees feel pain and whether insects can feel pain is essentially a question of whether or not insects have experiences. Now, the question of whether or not an insect has experience is the question of how does an insect, which is basically just a big lump of various molecular interactions, produce an experience, and how can humans, who are just a giant bag of water with a bunch of molecules floating around in them, produce subjective experiences? So just to illustrate this problem of how can a physical system produce a subjective experience, we have, and this is called the hard problem, by the way, which I'll reiterate later. If we look at something like alcohol is actually a very simple molecule. And we drink it, it enters the bloodstream, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it actually more or less stifles the interactions between neurons, which is why it's a depressant. And somehow, somewhere in this process, which is entirely mechanical, like we can document exactly what an alcohol molecule looks like, how it enters the bloodstream, how it interacts with synapses, how its biochemical effects completely. How on earth does this result in that euphoric experience or that disorienting experience that people have when they drink too much? So what we're asking here is, how do physical things result in subjective experiences? And this is probably the biggest problem today in philosophy and psychology. And it was coined by Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers, who are very big-name philosophers. And if we can solve this question of how can a physical system, which again is dead matter moving and interacting with itself, produce a subjective feeling, then we could definitively answer the question of whether or not insects feel pain. And the interesting thing is we know that somehow this gap is bridged, this gap between dead molecular machines just interacting with each other turns into a subjective felt experience in humans. We know this happens, but we don't know whether it happens in other animals. And if it does happen in certain other animals, say in higher apes or in dolphins, how low does it go? And to answer this question, we basically have to look at how the organization of a nervous system, which we've already looked at with the differences between human and insect and bee nervous system organizations, how does the organization of a nervous system allow blind chemical and electrical interactions turn into a felt subjective experience? So how does molecules of alcohol bouncing around across the blood-brain barrier turn into the feeling of being euphoric and dizzy? So when we look at pain, there's a similar thing. There's a famous statement in philosophy of mind that pain is the firing of C fibers, and C fibers are these afferent fibers of neurons that take pain signals up into the brain. But how is it that a little electrical signal traveling along just a little thin piece of meat going up into your brain, which is just another piece of meat, turn into a feeling? And so when we're looking at this when we're trying to study this in humans, we can study the feeling of pain by asking people. You rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. How much does this hurt? How do you feel right now? But when we're studying animals, we can't access their feelings, their subjective emotions, and their subjective experiences.
We can watch the reactions.
But we can watch the reactions.
Okay.
And this isn't perfect. So when we study emotion, and pain is a form of emotion or a kind of a complex emotion, we can't study the subjective experience of pain, but we can study whether or not they're experiencing what's called an emotion state.
So when we see an insect and it's jumping because of pain, we don't really know immediately whether it would be just like getting hit in the knee by a doctor's hammer and the knee jerking, because that, again, doesn't necessarily send a full suite of information to the brain, but it's localized.
We don't know at all whether or not if we see, for example, like a cockroach eating its entrails, is it having a horrible subjective experience? Like if you were that cockroach, would you be suffering? Or is it just like looking at a catapult doing something complex where it's lifting its arm, it's firing, it's chucking a rock? There's nothing it feels like to be that catapult. It's just doing something. It's like a knee-jerk response.
Right, because the people say that if you ants, there's a weird no fall damage. In games,
yeah.
Like they say ants have no fall damage.
Yeah, well, that's because of their exoskeleton.
Right.
Because
or even grasshoppers, like they can jump to they're a little tiny thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but the critical question we're looking at here, I guess there's two of them. The first one is if a bee has, let's say, a leg ripped off.
Yeah.
And it's showing some sort of a pain response or what looks like a pain response. Is there anything it's like to be that bee? If you were that bee, would it hurt? Or is it just displaying some complex physical reaction that doesn't feel like anything?
It's like if I built like a little Mindstorms robot, like those little Lego robots that people used to play with in elementary school. If you take off its arm, it's not suffering. But if you take off a human's arm, it is suffering. So how is it that the human, with a much more complex organization, feels something when it has damage, and the little robot doesn't? It's just mechanical. And the question is where does the bee fall in that continuity?
Okay, so what you're kind of leading us to then is what role does this sense, like do we even need consciousness? Like what role does this lead us to?
Well, that's a very big question of why do we need consciousness? And then the standard answer, at least that I would give, is that our environment that we exist in as human beings is far too complex for us to be able to survive and reproduce in if we were simply stimulus response machines. So at some point in this long, multi-billion year evolution of life on Earth, we somehow managed to become so complex in our mediation between inputs of visual or auditory inputs and our motor outputs that somehow, and this is the core of the hard problem, there became something it's like to be us. So for some reason, for there to be something it's like to be a human being, for there to be emotions that we feel, pains that we feel, thoughts that we have, somehow that's relevant to our survival and reproduction. The question, and for example, like on the slide,
for humans.
For humans, exactly.
Right.
But for plants, we don't need this. A plant has a relatively simple environment to exist within. It should grow up, and it should leaf out, and then the leaves will dry up and die out. And it has this. It's easier for a plant to survive and reproduce in its environment in a way that's governed entirely by simple molecular mechanisms. It doesn't need there to be something it feels like to be it. But for humans, we do for some reason, and again, this is the great mystery, why is it that we need to have subjective feelings in order to survive and reproduce effectively? And our question here with the relevance to whether or not bees feel pain is whether or not the environment of a bee and the organization of its nervous system as a result has a sufficient complexity for it to require to have subjective feelings. A plant doesn't need to. A plant is simple enough that a chain of molecules can sort out its survival and reproduction. A human does need to. We are not simple enough that we can simply be a set of knee-jerk reactions. We have to have subjective experiences. Why? We don't fully know. But the question is where does the bee lie? And I will maintain that we won't know until we've solved the hard problem of consciousness. And that probably won't happen in our lifetime.
Not in mine, I can assure you that.
Probably not mine either, but we'll see.
Bidzina.
They say that the soul has some weight, right?
So this is very interesting.
Yeah,
this is very this actually is a really good segue into whether bees have emotion states. And when people started studying bees, they went with the assumption, so the very first people, Jean-Henri Fabre, he was a French entomologist. He loved bees, and he obviously loved insects. He was the father of modern entomology, and he almost won a Nobel Prize in literature. He believed that bees were just machines, machine-like creatures. Karl von Frisch, he was an Austrian ethologist. He translated the waggle dance. He also loved bees. He thought that bees not only lacked subjective experiences, which isn't a crazy claim, we've been talking about that, but he also thought that their stimulus response systems for responding to pain were pretty much bunk. They weren't very robust. They didn't work very well. So he thought that they were completely just stimulus response machines. So your question about the soul, why does everybody start with the assumption that bees, let's say, to use your term, don't have souls and are just mechanical machines? The reason being can be traced back to René Descartes, who is this great philosopher, and he's basically the first guy we typically
René Descartes was French?
He was a French philosopher.
And about what time? Like 2 years ago or 200 years ago?
No, I was getting to that, and he's typically called the first modern philosopher.
Okay.
So this would be kind of the early 1700s. He's the first modern thinker, or what we would call the father of modern philosophy.
There's a famous quote attributed to him, right?
What is the quote?
If you think you are, therefore you you are. If you
I
think,
think
therefore you
I
are.
am.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think therefore I am. And this is actually the core of our question here.
Right.
His project was he basically wanted to get to a very robust foundation of philosophy.
Okay.
And he thought, what if we doubt everything? Like, have you ever had a dream where it's really vivid and it feels like it's real?
Right, like that's the new kind of phenomenon of like where everything is subjective. Nothing is objectively true.
Yes. So if we say nothing is objectively true, then
Right.
maybe all of our senses are fake.
Right.
Maybe we're just dreaming it all.
Yeah.
Or if you've ever seen a mirage in the desert,
Yeah.
it seems like there's water there, but again, maybe there isn't. Your senses are deceiving you.
Right.
So he said that
Maybe that's life.
The only thing that we cannot doubt is the fact that we are thinking. Because if you're doubting everything, like I doubt maybe I'm dreaming, maybe I'm hallucinating, maybe nothing is real. The only thing you can't deny is that you are having those doubts. So that's the idea of I think, therefore I am. I must exist.
So if you're thinking,
Yep.
therefore you're conscious.
Yes, and that we can't doubt. That's the only thing, according to Descartes, who set the foundations of modern philosophy, that can't be doubted.
Gonna be a couple nights thinking about that.
Yeah, that'll take a little while. You can think about that for quite a while. You can think about that for 300 years.
I'm going to circle us back around.
So how that plays into why people started out thinking that animals were simply stimulus response machines,
right.
particular bees, why they were just these stimulus response machines with no feeling, no soul, is because Descartes thought that if we can doubt everything that's physical, then that part of us that thinks, and therefore we are, must not be a physical thing. He called it a Cartesian mind. So there is an non-physical, eternal, and incorruptible something in us that was traditionally called a soul that could not be doubted and was always there. Now, well, if we have them, why not animals? Right. And he had a very, very funny little argument for this. And this is actually, it's a particularly ridiculous argument, but that he genuinely made it. And he thought that, well, a mollusk, like a little oyster, certainly doesn't have a soul. That would be ridiculous. So if a mollusk doesn't have a soul, then no animals should have souls, because if a god decided to give some animals souls and not others, the other animals would be jealous.
Okay, that's a bit ridiculous.
That's a bit ridiculous.
But now, I just want to interject something here really quickly, and that is what you just described is a Western perspective and not necessarily an Eastern perspective, because in Hindu belief or religion, that mollusk does have a soul.
Yes, and so this did exist within the Western tradition a very long time ago, and this is called the doctrine of the transmigration of souls. And this is particularly prominent with Plato. So Plato would have believed that mollusks, bees, all the animals have souls that are eternal, and that kind of loop in time where once you die, your soul becomes detached from your body, and eventually it becomes regrounded. And this very, very old belief remained in certain Eastern philosophical systems, like in Hinduism, but that's something that kind of fell out of Western thought, mostly with the advent of Christianity, or kind of more ripe Christianity. In early Christianity, there were certain thinkers, like someone named Origen of Alexandria, who still maintained a transmigration of souls. But that idea died out relatively early on, like around the year 400 or 500 in the Western world.
Right. The reincarnation thing is pretty... So there's Eastern culture definitely believes in a soul.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Yes.
Or their religions.
Most of them do.
Right.
We don't, okay, go ahead.
No, I don't know. I was just going to say, and then Christian cultures also, they definitely believe in a soul, but not
one in animals.
Well, someone like René Descartes, who we were just talking about, he was a very devout Christian, and in fact, his entire philosophy was trying to harmonize modern advancements in science with Christian thought. And one of the ways he did that is by trying to prove that we have immaterial souls, or these Cartesian minds, and that animals don't have them. But the fact that animals don't have them is why early entomologists like Jean-Henri Fabre and Carl von Frisch would have thought that bees are simply stimulus response machines.
Okay, and as you mentioned, Karl von Frisch.
Yes.
Now, he couldn't have thought that bees are entirely simple stimulus machines because he decided that bees must have a way of communicating the location and source and intensity and distance and direction of floral sources. So that takes a lot of thought. So it's not just a...
I wouldn't say thought. It takes complex information processing.
Okay.
So, for example, two computers are able to communicate vast amounts of information in a very complex way, but they are still essentially stimulus response machines.
Okay, touche. You're right about that. Look, we've only got about 5 minutes left to try to cover off everything there is to know about how bees think. So I'm going to kind of push us just a little bit.
We can push it for another 13 minutes.
Are you sure?
They said if we can show up just before 4 p.m. and
Okay.
it takes me about 10 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay. So
another 10 minutes, let's just say.
So let's ask this question then. Does consciousness, self-awareness, subjective experiences, are those things necessary for feeling pain?
For feeling pain, to having a subjective experience of pain, yes, you need to have consciousness. That's part of the definition. The definition of consciousness is to be capable of having subjective experiences.
Oh, okay.
So if a bee does not have consciousness, which we said to determine whether a bee has consciousness would require solving the hard problem,
which is not going to be done in my lifetime.
which is not going to be done in our lifetimes. But it is probably the biggest problem in science and philosophy right now, one of the most significant ones. But until we solve that, we wouldn't be able to say whether bees have consciousness or whether they have feelings of pain. Now, we can study whether bees have emotion states without studying whether or not they have feelings. So a lot of scientists who study emotions put aside the question of subjective experiences because we have to solve the hard problem. Everybody agrees that's going to be a while. Mm-hmm. But what they do is they focus on whether or not emotions in animals are simply rigid and inflexible stimulus responses or whether there's more flexibility there. So an emotion state, when we're studying it like this, what we say is that it's a state, a neurological or neural state that is scalable, meaning that an emotion can be more and less intense. It has valence, meaning it's a good feeling or a feeling that an animal seeks out, or it's a bad feeling or a feeling that an animal avoids. It persists, which is something that a stimulus response mechanism doesn't do. So if a doctor hits your knee with a hammer, your leg jumps once and then it stops. It's not going to continue doing that.
Okay.
But if you, for example, watch a scary movie, the moment the movie ends, you don't suddenly feel neutral again. You're kind of on edge for a couple hours. So there's a persistence to the state. It generalizes, which means essentially learning can occur. And you've already mentioned, we've had a couple examples of how insects can learn.
Right, and remember
with response to fear. So this already suggests that pain perception or nociception in insects is not purely stimulus response. It's probably something more complex than that.
But not necessarily consciousness.
But not consciousness. Okay. No, or we don't know, but I would argue likely not.
Okay.
So there are a couple other things like automaticity, like if you feel an emotion, you don't have to think about actively feeling the emotion, you just feel it. And another one is global coordination. So if you feel pain, for example, a whole host of things have to happen. You have to have changes in your cognition. You have to have changes in skin conductance responses. You have to have changes in how much adrenaline is going through your veins. So a lot of things happen. Now, how do we test this with bees? There's actually a very clever experiment that they use to test whether it's just a stimulus response mechanism in bees or whether it displays things like persistence, like it lasts, or whether it has global coordination, like many things are going on. And what they did is they took bees and they trained it to react to an odor. So if you give it let's say, and I don't think this is exactly how they did it in this experiment, but just for example, if you give a strong banana odor to a group of bees and you train them to then approach because they'll get sugar water, or if you give them another odor, let's say a citrus odor, and you train them to flee because there's danger, you can you can train them to react in one way or another to an odor. But now what you can do with odors is you can mix them together. So you can present bees with a 50-50 mix of, let's say, citrus and banana odor, and you can test whether they're like, oh, we're going to go approach, there's probably sugar water, or whether they decide to book it because they think there's danger. Now, what they did is they put bees in a jar and they shook it up. So they were inflicting pain and chaos on the bees.
Yeah.
And then they released them and had them smell this ambiguous 50-50 mix of odors. And they watched what the bees did. And if you inflict pain, we'll call it that, on bees by shaking them up really hard and then letting them out of the jar, and they have this ambiguous odor that they meet, they flee. So they have a pessimistic response after feeling pain. And this seems kind of weird, but this is significant because it shows that the experience of pain or getting all muddled up in a jar is responded to with persistence, that feeling persists, which suggests that it's not just some simple stimulus response, knee-jerk reaction. There's a more complex emotion state that's regulating the reaction to an ambiguous odor. So what we can tell from this experiment is that the experience of pain in bees, or the reaction to tissue damage in bees, is not just a simple stimulus response mechanism. There's something more complex going on. Can we say that they have a feeling of pain? No. Is it possible that they do? It's possible, but we won't be able to tell until we figure out how it is that a physical system, whether it's a human or a bee or a mollusk or a bacterium, translates little molecular mechanisms into subjective experiences.
Right.
And that's the hard problem.
So kind of what I'm hearing from all of this is pain is, it's a survival mechanism.
Yep.
Just like all the other mechanisms creatures have. And the environment that bees live in, the way that they develop their pain nervous system is completely different from ours.
Yeah, it's very different. Yeah.
They do feel pain, but just
They don't feel
They
pain.
don't feel pain, but they perceive pain and to use it to
They
survive.
react to
They
pain
react
to
to
survive.
pain, right?
But whether or not they feel pain is the golden question, and that's something that we simply can't answer.
It's almost kind of like the it's almost like, I don't want to get sidetracked, but like the lobster story. You know how the lobster changes into the bigger shell. It has to feel uncomfortable. So it has a shell, and then it outgrows its shell, and then the only way it changes into a new shell is it feels uncomfortable. So then it comes out of its shell and it finds a bigger.
Well,
so its pain is what drives it to.
But it's whether that pain
grow.
is like pushing a button on the computer
Right.
telling it to change its shell or to reboot,
Or
or whether it has the feeling of, oh God, this is so uncomfortable, I hate
Right,
this.
right, yeah. Does it uncomfortable feeling? Yeah.
And how do we get the nervous system in the lobster to translate from just something like a button press of like, all right, time to change, to having the feeling of discomfort? And that's the big mystery, and that applies to bees as well.
Okay. Is there a way we can summarize what we think about bees feeling pain?
Well, I think the summary would be that bees display responses to tissue damage that show more complexity than if it were just a very simple stimulus response mechanism like a doctor tapping your knee. So we know that the way bees feel pain is something more than just a quick on-off switch or a pain-no pain switch or
Instinct.
a do this, don't do this switch. They show persistence, it shows global coordination, which suggests that it's an emotion state. Now, what we can't say is whether this emotion state is felt. For that, we have to figure out how neurological processes, like the emotion state reacting to pain in a bee that's just been shaken in a jar, turns into a feeling. And that is probably the biggest question in philosophy and neuroscience today, called the hard problem. And that's something that right now we simply can't answer. And so we can't say whether the bee, when it gets shaken up, whether it feels uncomfortable or whether it's simply a complicated and coordinated response to a central emotion state.
Yeah.
But we can say that they do not feel pain, right?
We can't quite
Right.
say that either.
Not yet, but everything kind of points in that direction that they don't have the traditional sense of feeling that that whatever we
Again,
attribute.
we don't know for sure.
Okay, we don't know for sure.
Because if we solve the hard problem, and I can tell you, like, this mechanism or this structure in the brain causes us to be able to have subjective experiences, then we could look at the bee and say, does it have this structure?
Okay.
But until we know what that structure is or what that organizational principle is, because we don't know how
Right.
this
We
is
haven't
solved.
even figured that out in
Yeah,
humans.
so we actually
Okay, I
can't
see.
say that bees don't feel pain. I would personally say it's probably unlikely because how out of less than 1 million neurons can you coordinate a translation from a physical system to a a felt state? Could you do that with 1 million when humans can manage it, and perhaps only humans can manage it with 96 billion? So I think it's unlikely, but we can't say for sure.
That brain size. So one thing that I think is important for us to end on here is the idea, or the trying to understand whether or not bees feel pain leads up to something on the ethics of treating insects, whether it be silkworms, or whether it be raising worms for fishing, or whether it be beekeeping, and I think that's kind of where I wanted to end our discussion. Is so at this point in time, we probably don't need to over trouble ourselves with the idea that we are injuring, hurting, causing intense dismay, discomfort, mental discomfort to bees as we make mistakes in beekeeping. I mean, most beekeepers will never kill a bee. They certainly don't try to. Accidents happen, and we do unintentionally hurt bees. But there are a number of ethical things. So what would happen to our beekeeping if we finally discovered that bees can feel pain? Would we want to stop beekeeping, or would we have to completely change what we're doing?
Yeah, commercial beekeeping might be completely looked at a different way.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't stop us from eating beef.
That's our commercial for. Yeah.
Yeah, and running slaughterhouses
Right.
and so on.
Yeah, exactly. We know they feel pain.
Yes, we do,
Yeah.
but we still continue to do these highly abusive things to animals, and maybe we're doing them to bees too.
Yeah. But we should wrap up here.
Okay. Yep, you're right. We need to be ending here. So yeah, this has been great. Really appreciate having Daniel come in today. We covered a lot of material in a lot of different directions, but I think we did kind of come to a much more clear understanding about what pain means and what it might mean to bees.
But we still ended off with no clear answer.
No clear
because
answer.
we won't be able to definitively say whether they do or don't until we've solved the hard problem, and that won't be now.
One podcast at a time.
One podcast
Exactly.
at a time. Yes.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Oh, it's
And,
been great. Been great. Really
No,
appreciate
it has been actually.
Yeah.
Very
Thanks so
pleasant.
much.
Yeah. We'll have you back sometime when we have more.
Well, I probably won't be here in person. I'll
philosophical-
probably have to be zoomed in because I'm heading back off to McGill.
Maybe we could put you up here.
Oh, that would
Yeah,
be fun.
You'll be up on the wall.
Keep
and,
looking into the big questions. So.
Yeah. No, that's great. So you have been listening to About Bees, Culture, and Curiosity with René Miksha, and
Bidzina Mosiashvili.
we really appreciate everybody's listening, and we'll be back again.
Yes.
And I think our next episode is actually going to be about sounds, and we'll talk more about that next time. But
All right.
Bidzina, glad you made it back from Toronto.
Yes.
It was wonderful that you came back here just
In one piece.
Yeah. That was.
But, anyways, see you guys next week, and we'll wrap up here.
Okay.
All right.
So long, folks. Thank you.
Bye-bye.